everyone, welcome. It's Adrian Groenewald again on Global Leadership Conversation 1 for the Global Leadership Platform. It's wonderful to be with you. As always, I've got a special guest, Dr. Andy Brough. He's a very experienced executive leadership coach and travels all over working with leaders and would have strong views regarding the two specific questions for our first Global Leadership Conversation. So, Andy, it's really good to have you with us. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
So, Andy, two simple questions, but one can talk about it for a long time, except we're trying to keep it very specific and essence conversation. But first question, what is the most important quality or attribute we need to develop or awaken or improve in leaders if we are going to turn around the current global leadership crisis? What do you put at the very top?
So for me, in a word, it's responsibility. And maybe just let me qualify that, Adrian, by saying that, leadership works within a context. So when we work with leaders, we want them to take a systems view of the way that they think and the way that they act, that they can influence that process towards achieving a specific set of goals. But if we look at context, then there's no doubt that we are, as you correctly say, in a leadership crisis with diminishing trust levels, people being more and more skeptical about leadership, whether we're talking in the political space or in the corporate space. In the South African context, we've seen some really dramatic decisions taken by leaders, even in the corporate sector, that are having untold implications for investors, for employees, for local communities. And so the responsibility piece, I think, is recognizing that as a leader, I have to give account. I have to account for my abilities, and I have to have the ability to give account. And I differentiate between accountability and responsibility in that certainly accountability is not something that can be delegated. So in a word, it would be this idea of giving account, taking responsibility, and understanding that when I make decisions as a leader, it's not just, as we would have said 20, 30 years ago, looking at leadership from a leader-follower perspective only, but now taking a leader-stakeholder view and understanding that certainly where I work in the reputation economy, that every leader is only one comment or one tweet or one decision away from a potential reputational buy-in from stakeholders or people actually rejecting you, because we live under much more intense scrutiny. And so we have to be willing to, answer and give clear answers for the decisions that we take and for how we lead. So in a word, responsibility, Adrian.
Okay, so and taking responsibility not just for my job as the CEO of this large organization, but all the stakeholder relationships. My responsibility in terms of the impact my organization would have on a much broader societal space, in a much broader societal space. It's not just my employees, it's everything, because everything integrates with everything today. So that's what I also hear you saying sort of in the background. But although you gave me a good run-up to your first choice of what we need to, jack ourselves up on when it comes to the leadership crisis, namely responsibility and what goes with that, why is that your number one? Do you have a little bit more around that, as opposed to so many other things you have?
Yeah, I mean, leadership is not a binary thing, and so it's very difficult to simply say that's the one thing we have to focus on, because again, we have to look at it within context. But, certainly in the work I've done over the last 20, 25 years, and we both know as practitioners of leadership that there are various schools of thought of leadership, and we're at a place now where I think the question front and center is, what does it mean to be an authentic leader? What does it mean to be a leader who, builds from the basis of personal conviction, values, a sense of purpose beyond just making profit? And certainly when one looks at what drives leadership reputation, which is an area I have a particular interest in, then a couple of things become very immediately apparent. The first is that people do not differentiate between the behavior of the leader and the behavior of the company, particularly if we're talking at CEO level. So there's a strong correlation there. I think the other thing is that in this new world of work, that ability to try and straddle both ethics and profitability is something that many leaders grapple with. And so at the center of that is this idea of responsibility, that I have to try, as difficult as it is, to serve multiple stakeholders, and I have to do that from the basis of a character-based, integrity-based approach, which means that ultimately I have to lead myself and take responsibility for leading myself before I can even think about leading others. So maybe that just gives a little bit more background to the approach. And, I think when I talk to my leadership students, there is definitely a discrepancy between the kind of leader that I'm talking about and many of the examples that we see on the political platform or the business platform. And so sometimes there's a credibility gap, I think, between what I would see as being the key drivers for leadership and some of the role models that are out there. And often there is, I think, on the part of people who are interested in leadership, a question around that discrepancy. So, Andy, you're talking about this leader who needs to be responsible, who needs to be authentic, who needs to be value-based, who needs to lead from a sense of purpose, from a sense of recognizing the impact of his or her decisions on multiple stakeholders. And then in reality, we see leaders who occupy those positions of authority who don't necessarily do that. And so twinned with that idea of responsibility, I think, is recognizing that as a leader, it's not just about position. It's not just about being assigned the corner office. It's not just about title, but it's recognizing that I need to take responsibility for the influence that I have, even when I don't necessarily have the authority that goes with it. One of the things that we see, Adrian, is organizations are more virtual. They are more results-only work environments. They are separated by, very often, because of technology, time zones, geography, distance. And so if my thinking around leadership is when I have climbed the corporate ladder, then I will lead, I think in the new world of work, that's the wrong thinking. We are going to be working with people very often who are not our direct reports, over whom we have no formal authority, but who we still need to be able to influence. And so taking that decision to influence from the basis of responsibility and being willing to give account for my actions, and then thinking about those drivers of responsibility as earning trust. Can I do what I say I will do? Am I dependable? Do I lead from the basis of integrity? Do I lead from a sense of purpose? Those are the things I think that come around my thinking of this idea of responsible leadership.
Okay. Powerful things. We can have so much conversation around that in itself, but let me go to question 2. How do we best develop or awaken or improve this quality of responsibility in leaders? Obviously, the way I was brought up plays a massive role. In my home environment, we all know that the first school of leadership is probably the family. So let's, setting that aside though, when you sit with leaders and you coach them, or when practitioners go out and develop leaders, training courses, programs, doesn't matter. How's the best way? What's the best way to develop them to be more responsible? Is there a way?
So I don't think there's any quick fix or silver bullet, Adrian, but a couple of the things that we found really are important is to start with this idea of self-awareness. So working with the individual leader to identify who am I as a person, what drives me, what are my motivators, what are my values. And I think one of the greatest sadnesses that I see in working a lot historically around trying to help organizations achieve alignment with their corporate values is, companies will be very strong on this is our mission, this is our vision, these are our values, and now we expect you as an employee to embrace that. But very often, those same individuals have never had an opportunity to really think about what drives them. What are their personal values? To self-reflect on who are they as a person? Why are they at work? What do they bring in terms of a greater sense of fulfillment? So if we're going to talk about responsibility, I think it has to start, first of all, with a sense of who am I? Why am I here? Why am I leading? What is my purpose? What is my intent? And that sounds almost trite, Adrian, but the journey to leadership, I think, begins with self-awareness. And I'm working with many leaders in different parts of the world who don't really have the opportunity very often, or don't even know how, to begin that process of engaging in self-reflection, thinking about decisions they took in the past that may have had intended or unintended consequences, and then reflecting on, how do I create that alignment between who I am as a person and what's important to me and the work that I do as a leader. So, and that doesn't have to wait for an executive coach. That's something that can be done, much earlier on in our careers. And I think very often we wait too late to give people exposure to those kinds of opportunities to really self-reflect and close that authenticity gap between who I am really as a person and how I want to be as a leader, and to try and close that possible division between the need to in many cases occupy a mask, wear a mask that means I'm not being authentic, because I'm fearful that if people really get to know who I am, they're going to discover my my insecurities and my inadequacies. So that self-reflection, I think, is part of that process.
Yeah, powerful stuff, Andy. Thank you for that. And something powerful you said, important you said, I think, is that you don't have to wait for some coach or anyone or the organization to put me on a leadership program for me to start that journey of self-discovery. That's the first thing. Second thing is, you can go on a coaching program, fine, and you can also go on a training program or read a book, but realize that the human being is so dynamic that you could go on that journey forever. And I think you discover new parts of yourself when you go into new responsibilities and new positions and bigger things to do. So it's a lifelong journey. That's what my experience is. So very powerful responsibility. And then to help someone on that journey towards that responsibility, you mentioned as the top quality potentially that we need to develop to turn around the leadership crisis, is that self-reflection, self-awareness, going on that journey, starting with the self, taking responsibility for myself and then aligning it with the organization. So you mentioned, I can just see your experience. You mentioned so many important, valuable elements. For example, the organizations go through these wonderful, expensive exercises of discovering their visions and missions and their values. But the individual who must make it happen never have that privilege necessarily, or very seldom do. So wonderful things. You've opened up the door to many other conversations. We will have Global Leadership Conversation 2 and 3 in the future, but we've got your voice out there, Andy, and we really appreciate it, your time and your effort just for a few minutes to do that. So thank you so much. We appreciate it. It's Dr. Andy Brough, experienced executive leadership coach, that comes through in your comments, and we value your time. Thank you for your input.
My pleasure, Adrian. Great to be with you today. Thanks so much.
Thanks.